We are starting the second panel discussion of today, which will naturally flow from the pre-lunch panel, which concentrated on politics and the civil society. We shall speak about the universal problems which we all encounter. And this is something that we have observed before. We have seen how the problems of political order, how the problems of political regimes are splicing Europe, and we shall continue with this discussion in a slightly different context by describing and discussing some of the things and challenges which we all face as a planetary species. So we shall be speaking about immigration, we shall be talking about problems of universal, indeed global importance and universal consequence. Let me introduce our experts. Madam Guri, representing the World Climate Consortium. Svetlana Gannushkina, prominent human rights activist from the Civic Assistance Human Rights Organization. She will deliberate on the immigration and a member of Memorial Foundation, and Despina Syrri, the head of the International School for Migration Politics and international cooperation in Greece. So let me giving the broaching this panel discussion with the deliberations on the climate, which is something which we all face as a planet. One can hardly think up a more universal problem than the climate. And even against the background of some skepticism which still exists with respect to the climate change, we still see that this problem is splitting the world, especially after President Trump announced reviewing the US policies with respect to climate policies. So the floor is yours, Guri. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here at the Berlin Forum. Thank you for inviting me. I'm representing CICERO, Center for Climate Change Research in Oslo. We do cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary studies of the climate change issue, both from a natural science view, but also from a social science view. And I'm a political scientist myself, and I will talk about the political complexities and challenges related to climate change. So we see that climate change is a direct threat to humanity, but also this is a very complex societal challenge to solve. And there are several issues that are there are several elements that I would like to touch upon with this societal challenge. It is first that the climate change issue is a problem that has a very long time horizon. So we're looking into a problem that is going to last for at least a century, and the solutions that we are pondering upon now will take effect in many, many years. So it has a very long time horizon. The goals that politicians are talking about now will not are reaching into the future for more than one generation. So it's an intergenerational problem, which add to the complexity, because we're not only talking about solutions that we can handle here and now in our generation, but it also touches upon the next generation and several generations ahead of us. So this adds to the complexity. And also there are large immediate costs of handling this problem, because we are facing a complete societal transformation in terms of electricity systems, for instance, and transport systems, etc. So we're facing a very big societal challenge that will transform the way that we are living today. But these changes will have large immediate costs, but we won't see the benefits until many, many years ahead. So this is also that we, as a generation now, takes on a large costs that will benefit future generations. As Mikhail touched upon, this is a very politicized and a politicized issue that has brought on additional polarization in the world that we live in, and a conflict about how to solve this problem. So it is a very politicized issue, which means that the knowledge that are being produced is not necessarily taken for granted. So there are a lot of questions about the science of climate change, and there are also large questions about how we are going to, or what kind of solutions that we are going to choose, what kind of policy instruments, and are we going to prioritize these policies now over other political issues that we have debated earlier today. And in a last element of this complexity is that there is a lack of public pressure from people towards politicians to handle the issue and to find solutions here and now that can sort of produce solutions that will be durable for the future. So there is also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of climate change, because we see the science is developing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a collection of scientists that are assessing the newest knowledge about the problem, both natural science and social science, and they are making these big assessments, the IPCC reports. And there was recently a new report that came out last month in October that assessed the consequences of warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the report made it even more clear than before that this problem is very urgent, that we need to act now. We cannot postpone actions on climate change anymore, because if people and if politicians don't do anything about the problem now, then we will see a warming above 1.5 degrees already in 2040. And the consequences is outlined in this report, which is quite dire. Among other things, coral reefs will die. There will be huge consequences on food production, and these are problems that need to be handled. Furthermore, the Trump administration actually released the 4th National Climate Assessment last Friday. And this report is produced by 13 US agencies that have looked upon the consequences for the US of global warming. And they underline that the US must act immediately, or else the economic consequences will be very large. The US would face a 10% reduction of their GDP towards the end of the century if no action is taken, and if temperatures rise above 2 degrees. So the science is pretty clear. Furthermore, there has been a very long process of international negotiations to find solutions about how the global society should work together to handle this problem. this is a global challenge. It is very complex, and it's really necessary that all countries could contribute in a strong collaboration to face the problem. And negotiations have been going on more or less since the beginning of the 1990s, and was crowned with success, one could say, in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was adopted. The Paris Agreement sets some very clear targets. So the first target is that warming should be kept well below 2 degrees Celsius, and efforts should be made to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So this means actually huge reductions of carbon emissions. And rich countries must provide finances for developing countries to make them capable of handling the consequences of climate change, because some of the consequences of global warming are already in the pipeline and cannot be stopped. So, developed countries must continue to take the lead in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So it is the responsibility of the developed countries to go ahead and take the first steps, but all countries have pledged to do what they can to reduce their emissions or reduce their emissions growth. It should be an aim for all countries to have a peak of greenhouse gases as soon as possible, and to achieve rapid reductions from 2050. And after 2050, we should really see a net zero emissions level. There should also be a level of burden sharing, where developed countries must help developing countries to handle the consequences. And every 5 years, there should be a review of the pledges that countries make in the Paris Agreement, so that every 5 years, the ambition is that countries should strengthen their targets to reduce emissions. So in Paris, every country pledged a certain level of emissions reductions, and these should be strengthened every 5 years. Yes, so those are the main points of the Paris Agreement. And since 2007, we have seen that there has been an initiation and adoption of climate policies across the world. So the attention level towards climate policies and climate strategies and planning to handle climate change is increasing across the world. I had a very cool map that I planned to show on an overhead, but in this map you can see that climate laws are increasing all across the world. The question is whether they will be implemented and whether the targets will be achieved. So the next step, when countries have actually adopted either climate laws, like a lot of countries have climate laws. Brazil has one, India has one, Norway has one, several countries have climate legislation. Also, many countries now have a clear strategy for reducing their emissions and a pledge in the Paris Agreement. The question now is whether countries are actually implementing policy instruments to reduce their emissions. And a few countries have actually achieved a lot of emission cuts. One good example is the United Kingdom, which has reduced their emissions actually to 1890 levels now. So they are sort of returning towards pre-industrial levels. And this is in all majority, it is because they have transformed their energy production or electricity production. They have phased out more or less the use of coal, and replaced it with renewable energy, increased the renewable energy level, and they have applied some very good renewable or subsidies, incentive structures for renewable energy, but also they have managed to phase out coal. And this is really key because coal is the major contributor to carbon emissions in the world today. Another country that has a mixed level of implementation of policies is China. China has started to make some policy changes. For instance, China has introduced some pilot systems of carbon pricing in some regions in the country. So there are a lot of, there are 8 pilot systems of carbon emissions trading. And the plan for China is to introduce a national carbon emissions trading system. A little bit uncertain how that will look and when it will come online, so to speak. But there are some good work being done in China to try to reduce emissions in terms of introducing a carbon price. And also, China is one of the world leaders in terms of investing in renewable energy. But also, China is investing a lot in coal. So still, there is a lot of coal power plants being introduced in China and built in China and are in the planning stages. So even though China has cut a lot of their coal use, they are still using about 60% in their energy mix to produce electricity that comes from coal. So coal is a big factor in China still. And then there is the United States of America, which is struggling at the moment, I would say, with policy instability. So most of you know that Obama, when he was president, he introduced a legacy or a very strong package of policies that were supposed to get US emissions down to 1990 levels. And he introduced, for instance, an emission standards for electricity production, so that, and that would mean in essence that coal would be phased out of the electricity system in the US, more or less, and replaced by natural gas. Furthermore, the Obama administration introduced some very strict emissions standards for cars to reduce the emissions from cars, and also some regulations concerning methane emissions from shale gas drilling. But all of these are under attack now from the Trump administration, which is trying to roll back all of the regulations that the Obama administration introduced. This will, of course, take some time. It's not so easy to remove regulations in the US system, so it will be a long process with court cases and regulatory processes to remove these Obama administration policies. But I think the lesson from the US is that there is a tendency to have policy instability because there is no political agreement in the US that they want to have a strong climate policy, at least not at the federal level. There is a lot of things going on in some of the states, for instance in California and in New York and in other states, but at the federal level there is a rollback process going on right now, trying to remove policies. So in general, what we see is that greenhouse gas emissions in the world are continuing to increase, despite of the Paris Agreement targets, and this is kind of discouraging. If the Paris Agreement targets are reached, then we could see a development towards the end of the century where we see a temperature increase of about 3.5 degrees. So much more is needed than what has been accepted in the Paris Agreement. And this rule in the Paris Agreement to increase the ambitions of targets every 5 years is crucial if the climate change problem is going to be met in time to avoid the most dangerous temperature increases. Thank you.
Just before we move on, I have just one question, and we will move on to our next subject. There was, at least at some point before, there was a scientific debate, not about the global warming itself, but about the human factor impact in global warming. What is the dynamics of this debate? Is there growing evidence of the human factor impact in the whole thing?
Yes, there is 99% certainty now from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that that human activity is the main cause of the temperature increases that we're seeing, and the main cause of the temperature rises that are expected over the next century. So yes, definitely, the evidence is pretty strong.
К нашим другим темам, и я попрошу...
It's on our agenda, and I would request that this topic has been already discussed today, and I suggest that Despina Syrri, as we heard to the wonderful presentation on Pope Francis, who started by traveling to the refugees, and after that, I'll give you the floor, Despina.
Thank you very much. Thank you also very much for the invitation. The Civic School of Political Studies of Thessaloniki in Greece actually does a lot of work on migration and refugees, and many of you must have noticed that in our last 4 years, in groups of participants that come to the World Democracy Forum in Strasbourg, there is always people of a migrant background, asylum seekers, or recognized refugees. So thank you very much for the invitation. I will rely on my notes since I'm quite tired. And Greece continues to be the major entry point into Europe for refugees and migrants, and has received well over 1 million since 2015, which was the year, the turning around year. While the implementation of the European Union-Turkey statement and closure of the Balkans route in March 2016 significantly slowed the migration flows, as of October 2018, in Greece there remain about 70,000 refugees and migrants that have arrived after 2015, and with the previous population of migrant origin, it is well over 200,000. And some of these, about 15,000 are on the islands and about 55 in the mainland. Now, what is the situation about these people that have arrived after 2015? There has been a political choice between the European Union and the Greek government to create an archipelago of about 50 refugee camps in the mainland, which can be described as container warehouses for people, and about 10 hotspots in the islands, which are mainly places of detention and clearance for periods over much longer than 1 year, where living conditions are atrocious, dangerous, and very degrading for human beings, according to the Council of Europe Committee for the Prevention of Torture. Moria camp in Lesbos Island is the shame of Greece and of Europe in tandem. During 2017, the number of human flows decreased, yet from the beginning of 2018, with more arriving each day both from the sea and from the land border, it became very clear that sustainable and responsible solutions are in order. Now, if policies were indeed decided relying on evidence and on rational thinking, the priority for the Greek government would have been to speed up the asylum process, to fully undertake the reception of the new arrivals, as well as the integration of those staying in the country with some sort of legal status. Also, the rational decision for all the other European governments would have been to engage in truly developing and truly implementing a cohesive, just, and sharing migration policy. Instead, what we witness is that the Greek government, since 2019 is going to be an election year at all levels, sort of shifting responsibility for the reception and the integration to intergovernmental organizations, such as the IOM, the Organization for Migration, and of the European Union member states, ending any program of resettlement and increasingly refusing several EU member states, governments to accept any refugees on their soil. So we have a crisis, but a crisis of what? The crisis faced by both the European Union and Greece has been identified primarily as a crisis of policy and of management. Is it, though, only an issue of management? Why is migration so annoying when we actually know that migration is diachronic, has been there since the beginning of humanity? Why is there such a growth of racism and xenophobia, even fascist political formation, in the name of countering migration flows? Actually, migration has played almost no part in fostering the changes that have left many people in Europe feeling disaffected and disconnected in the past 2 decades. Migrants are not responsible for the weakening of the welfare systems, for the transformation of mainstream political parties, for the lack of trust to political elites, or for the imposition of austerity policies, for example, in Greece. Migration has, however, come to be a means through which many perceive these changes. The so-called left behind, largely because of economic and political changes. But they came to see their marginalization and their losing of trust in political systems primarily as a cultural loss. The very decline of the economic and political power of the citizens and the weakening of organizations and political parties have helped to very much obscure the economic and political roots of social problems. As culture has become the medium through which social issues are refracted, so the left behind have also come to see their problems in cultural terms. They have turned to the language of identity to express their discontent. The sense of belonging to a group or to a collective has historically been expressed in 2 broad forms, through the politics of identity and through the politics of sharing and solidarity, including the development of universal values. The former stresses attachment to common identities based on such categories as race, nation, gender, or culture. The latter draws people into a collective not because of a given identity, but to further a political or social goal, such as universalism. The question increasingly people ask themselves today is not so much in what kind of a society do I want to live in, as to who are we? The 2 questions are, of course, intimately related, and any sense of social identity must embed an answer to both. But as the political sphere has narrowed, and as mechanisms for political change have eroded, so the answer to the question, in what kind of society do I want to live, has become shaped less by the kinds of values or institutions people want to struggle to establish than by the kind of people that they imagined that they were before. The answer to who we are has become defined less by the kind of society they want to create than by the history and the heritage to which supposedly they belong. Or to put it in another way, as broader political, cultural, and national identities have eroded, and as traditional social networks, institutions of authority, but also moral codes have weakened, so people's sense of belonging has become much more narrow and parochial, molded less by the possibilities of a transformative future than of an often very mythical past. The frameworks through which we make sense of the world today are defined less as liberal or conservative than as Muslim or white or English or European. Even identities such as liberal or conservative are seen now as cultural as much as they are political categories. Migration, thus, has become the means through which many of the left behind or the disconnected or the youth, as said before, perceive their sense of loss of status in society. For example, a frequent complaint by older people usually is that things have changed so much that I feel a stranger in my own country. What such attitudes express is a sense of a world out of control and of a lack of agency in being able to shape their world as individuals. Little seems to express that sense of uncontrollable change than migration. That is why several politicians' promises to build walls on borders resonate so deeply with their supporters and with their electorates. It is a physical symbol of their desire to bring the world under control, walls on borders. Of course, it is true that migration clearly has brought major changes in the physical character of European cities and towns, in the rhythm of social life, and in the sense of what it is to be British or German or Swedish. But migration alone is not driving social changes, nor is it even the most important driver of social change. Has not a single immigrant come to Britain or Germany or Sweden, Britons and Germans and Swedes today would still be living in a vastly different world and nation from that of a half a century ago. Feminism, consumerism, the growth of youth culture, greater individual freedom, the atomization of society, the decline of traditional institutions such as the church, all have helped transform these nations, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But it is immigrants who primarily have become symbolic of change, and of change for the worse. The symbolic character of hostility to immigration can be seen in voting patterns. The symbolic power of migration derives also from the way that the issue has been framed by politicians on all sides. On the one side, politicians have recognized a need for migration for economic reasons. On the other hand, they have promoted the idea of migration as a problem that must be dealt with. And at the same time, politicians often express disdain for those who express anxieties and fears about migration. And often politicians call these anxieties mere bigotry or racism. So it is this poisonous mixture of necessity, fear, and contempt that has helped both to stigmatize migrants, but also to create popular hostility towards the liberal elites for ignoring their views on immigration. What has created the current migration crisis is not that migrants have suddenly started arriving at Europe's border. Rather, two factors have changed. First, we have the spawning of savage conflicts in an arc from Afghanistan to Syria to Nigeria, the collapse of civil authority in much of that region, often as a result of outside intervention, the rise of Islamism, and particularly of the Islamic State, have all pushed much larger numbers to flee to Europe. Yet, large as they are, it is worth putting into context the numbers of refugees coming to Europe. 1 million refugees represents not much more than 0.2% of European Union's population. There are already 1.2 Syrian refugees in Lebanon, more than 20% of the population. That is the equivalent of Europe being host to over 100 million refugees. Turkey already hosts more than 3 million refugees. Pakistan and Iran have over 1 million. And in the space of merely 1 month in 2017, 500,000 Rohingya refugees have left to Bangladesh from Myanmar. Some of the poorest countries in the world already bear the greatest burden. If these countries were to adopt Europe's attitude, there really would be a migrant crisis. And that is perhaps the most reprehensible aspect of the European Union's policy. At its heart seems to be the idea that dealing with migrants and refugees should be an issue only for poor countries. The second factor in the current migrant crisis is the political context into which today's migrants come, the context of the economic, social, and political transformations about which I've already talked. It is not, as if it is often suggested, that hostility to migration has created disenchantment with mainstream politics, parties, and institutions. It is rather that the form that political disenchantment has taken is hostility to migration. Of course, it is quite tempting to view all this as a purely Western phenomenon, the product of racism and xenophobia, as something happening only in Europe and America. Yet, we can see similar developments right across the globe. In many African, Asian, and South American countries, too, the old order is under pressure from populist forces. Here, too, the old order is not represented, as in Europe and America, by the parties of right and left that shaped the post-war consensus. It is represented rather by the organizations that led struggles from freedom, from colonialism, or by the ideologies that claim to represent the identity of the free nation. Yet, just as in Europe and America, people have become disaffected with the old order. Just as in Europe and America, many of the opposition movements that give voice to the disaffected are shaped not by ideals and values, but by sectarian politics rooted in religious and in ethnic diversity. How we confront this crisis, not just in Europe, but globally, seems to me will shape the character of the coming period. Thank you.
That this problem seemingly doesn't seem to be that relevant. But how do things stand in point of fact? Well, in point of fact, the question of migration is closely linked to xenophobia. Xenophobia, if you believe Gordon Lawrence, is one of the main instincts of man. Regrettably, this is a natural sense, natural sentiment. And if you look at yourself carefully, you would certainly find something like it in yourself. So I'm quite convinced that a cultural man should fight within oneself with this attribute, with this trait, naturally. And when the government, the state, gives an impulse to overcome xenophobia, then we are successful. Should, which regrettably is very simple, the government makes use of this shortcoming of ours, in this way it is governing our behavior. If we come to realize that migration is a natural way of humanity developing today, I suppose this is a must. Many factors speak on this. First of all, they are the creation of the single information space, which we can see now evolving, and as it is. This is erasing borders. Could I in Soviet times have an idea that I will have a German visa for 5 years and an American for 3 years, and that I could just buy a ticket and travel to any country in the world? When I first got to Bulgaria, it came as a shock. How could this be? But nowadays we feel that it's not the case, and I don't suppose you can turn back here. Besides, we see rising speed of movement, and very rapidly and very easily indeed you could travel to a very different world, a very different location. So migration is a natural path for humanity developing, and we should agree to that. Does the international agencies understand that? Some facts show that yes, they do. I was ready to welcome and really admire when a year ago, September 2017, New York Declaration. New York Declaration, for the first time, came up with this wording that there is no clear-cut line between refugees and migrants. There is one and only process of migration, which may switch sort of varieties. Regrettably, Russia, although it joined the declaration, didn't receive it like other countries, and now we see a major document on developing the ideas of the New York Declaration, which Russia did not join altogether. For my country, that is fraught with danger. It seems to me that this is our common path, and this is what can be explained that the International Organization on Migration became part of the UN now. In point of fact, there are people who realize that, yes, they do, but at the same time, quite recently in Moscow, Moscow hosted a conference on migration. Some of those present here in this room attended that conference, and each one of them, one after another, would point out that there is an opposition, a standoff, a struggle between law and politics. This is exactly what we heard. Between law and politics, and who stands to win in this struggle? It's certainly politics, because it is shaped, policies are shaped by the people who are supposed to be supporting the law and should be implementing the law. But unfortunately, without the involvement, it wouldn't work. I would like to say a few words about this declaration, about what is being said there. It discusses exactly the rights that are inalienable for each human, and it's not what is part of human rights, it's also certain social rights. This is the right to education, access to medical care, a work, a job worthy of dignified human, and good payment, and the state doesn't want it and business doesn't want it, because using almost slavery, which is what is the case in Russia, because this is the source of super profits and super revenue, and it's very hard to say no to this. In Russia it happened since 2002, when they adopted a law which said that at that time the law made hiring a foreigner almost impossible, which doesn't at all mean that our former compatriots, former citizens of the Soviet Union or their descendants would not travel to Russia to work. They did, but they did it illegally. This illegal labor turned the system into a kind of fact slavery, in a way. I suppose one could speak abruptly about violating Article 4 of the European Convention, because some people who were banned from leaving the territory of the enterprise they worked in, people who could be, for example, not paid and could be kicked out. In point of fact, they were economic slaves. In 2007, several changes took place, but regrettably, one couldn't say no to this huge revenue. It would be too hard for business to say no to this. And I think that certainly work should continue on this, and maybe, well, regrettably, Russia didn't exceed the conventions of the ILO, International Organization on Migration. It's very hard to make report and be accountable for the conventions to a country that is not a signatory. That's why it doesn't want to recognize, but some international attention for that is needed. And on my behalf, they wanted me to ask about the work of NGOs. And I wanted to say that surely that the NGOs also try to take some measures and help the migrants. For example, our organization in 2015, could you imagine, went to court to the Ministry of Education, against the Ministry of Education of Russia. Our constitution, for that matter, it's an excellent constitution that we have. We have Article 43 that guarantees, mind you, to each and everyone. Some people think that the Constitution is only for citizens. It is not the case. The Constitution, if it is for citizens it certainly has some significance. It puts it explicitly that the citizen of the Russian Federation cannot be exiled or cannot be handed over to another state, extradited to another state. But when it says each and everyone, it means everyone with no exception. Not only do they have the right to study, this should be guaranteed. It must be ensured by, but must be provided for by the state. But an executive order was published by the ministry where migrants' children would not be taken to school. Only whose parents would have special registration of the domicilium sedandi whose children could be taken to school. Because the court took a very strong decision where it says that the executive order doesn't say these words exactly. You should interpret it in a different way. It's very strange that the Ministry of Education cannot formulate the executive order, that it should be interpreted in the same way by the Migration Authority, school headmasters, and whosoever. And you can take on kids without registration. But at that, you require legal status, and the Constitution doesn't provide for the legal status. It just says there is a kid living here in Russia and has to go to school. It certainly applies not only to that alone. We also work with those who, for example, have not received their payments. We try to agree with the employers, and regrettably, if we, for example, succeed in 50% of the salary should be returned, we think it's not that bad. But because very often an employee is not ready to go to court, because first of all, should he go, after that he will be fired, and regrettably an army of those who are willing to take his place is huge. That's why he will be left unemployed and will lose all job. There is a big difference between labor migration and migration, people who have to migrate. There's not clear-cut line. And very often labor migration is something where people stay with their families, stay back. They simply cannot find the job to ensure the minimum living standard. One could also give Syrian refugees who were in Russia, who are right now turned into refugees. But before that, near Moscow, we have two small Syrian groups who opened up their own factories. They are people who either have a citizenship or they are spouses of the Russian citizens who have some legal status. They mostly organized clothing production, and they invited their compatriots. Those would travel, they would work for a year, then they would go back, and they would return again, obtaining a visa. In 2014, time came when they could not travel back, and hence it became illegal. Moreover, they took out their families, and these people, they don't allow them asylum. It's a very difficult situation. Overall, there are no more than 5,000 to 6,000 compared to 3.5 million in Turkey alone. This is just little, but it turns out that our country is unable to take them on as refugees, and they remain in the country illegally. They're not granted either the status of a refugee or temporary asylum. Moreover, decisions are taken to deport them to Syria. Again, what can be done here? One can go to court in Russia and then to the European Court. The European Court is great hope. And this is the only mechanism, and I would hate to lose this mechanism, but one doesn't need to explain to this audience why this may happen. But on the other hand, it's clear that annexation of Crimea, as the speaker says, and the war that we unleashed in Ukraine, they are reasons to expel. But on the other hand, we would lose mechanisms such as there's only hope on this. How do you remove this contradiction? It's not clear to me. Well, the European Court last year, on the 21st of November, took a decision where 12 cases were put together as one hearing, where Russia was found culpable, even in its attempt to take decision to deport Syrian refugees. They were, for a long time, were in detention. They got certain compensation for that, also for being illegally imprisoned, as well as for the conditions they were contained in. Where they complained against the conditions, they recognized Russia in violation of another, yet Article 3, that is the one that bans torture. The conditions were recognized as, in point of fact, tantamount to torture. And certainly, for me, it remains, and for our organization, for the both organizations I work for, the main problem is those who are forced to migrate. They are, first of all, refugees and people seeking asylum. They are internally displaced persons, mostly from Chechnya, and those about whom Catherine Lalumiere mentioned today in her presentation, as she put forward this wonderful motto, we are all diverse, but we are citizens. Well, not necessarily, we all are, because there are some people who have no citizenship. And this is also a major problem. And this is something that falls under the mandate of the Supreme Commissioner for Refugees. Last year, in the report, it said that the number of people who are beyond the time.
So we are talking about a huge number in the world who are persons who are displaced persons, and that's almost 60 million of people, but it is indeed a very high number of people who are displaced, interned, or are without citizenship. And of course, the refugees is the most vulnerable category, which is up to 20 million. Of these, 11 million are refugees from Syria, and of these, 3 and 4 million are in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and other coterminous countries with Syria. And of course, Europe, which has, as far as I understand, accepted 2 million, and Russia, which has not been able to give shelter to 6,000 Syrians who have some ties with Russia. Что у нас с часами, Наталья? Потому что у меня все одинаково здесь и здесь. So the problem of extradition and deportation is, of course, a fact of life. But I can unfortunately also tell a sad story about Germany. A young person, Shamil Saltin Muradov, whose brother sought asylum in France. This is a family which is persecuted in Chechnya. His elder brother emigrated to France and got first an asylum and then became a naturalized citizen. He then asked and did for his brother to emigrate from Russia. He went through Belarus, then to Poland, and so they crossed the border between Belarus and Poland because the brother had a French passport. Then they moved through Germany, and in Germany they were stopped by the police. Shamil was detained. He was detained and spent several months, and it turned out that Russia had asked to extradite him, that person, Mr. Shamil Saltin Muradov, because he's under litigation in Russia. Sometime later, Germany declined extradition. At this point, there was a mistake which was made, quite accidental mistake, that young man must have continued to be in Germany. But the elder brother, who thought that Europe is a unified continent and the European Union, and they went into France. In France, the extradition checkup again took place, and France also declined extradition of that young man to Russia. So Russia must have never gotten that young man deported or extradited. So just as brother is waiting for him, for the younger brother to leave the deportation center, migration taper, but France deports, not deports, but readmits this person into Germany. This is Dublin Accord. According to the Dublin Accord, the place of first asylum seeking is the place where one should go through the procedure. This took place in January of 2013. I'm sorry, in January of 2017. So, on the 31st of January, and on the 14th of February of 2017, Germany sent the man back to Russia because he missed the procedure of clarifying his legal status. So, not much humanism here. This was just a deportation. This was not extradition. It was deportation of that man to Russia. And all German bureaucrats that I have talked about, how come that this man, the two European governments decided not to extradite the man because he may be subjected to torture, and the man was deported to Russia. Yeah? And they were telling me, the German civil servants were telling me, well, he was not extradited, he was deported. So he's in prison now. He is under criminal litigation, and he is facing 15 to 20-year prison term. So I sent an attorney at law to this man, and he confessed committing the crime. And unfortunately, we know the story of how many confessions are obtained at the Russian penitentiary institutions. Now, this is not to say that we're sitting without inaction, without any actions. No, we're trying. We have a project. We have a project which is called a project which is entitled the protection of the citizens of North Caucasian republics. But what can we do? Very often, we simply don't have the access to these people. And when we are sending in an attorney, an advocate, this may help or this may not help. We recently, a person who has spent 12 years in prison has been released. And it appears that the man who was driving the car was apparently related to the terrorist unit, but the man was just in that car 12 years ago. The driver was killed, but this man became a handicapped person in a wheelchair, and he spent 12 years in prison. So at the court it was said that it was his weapons that he owned these weapons found in the trunk of the car. So he spent 12 years in prison in a wheelchair with a special reference that this is a man who may escape. One wonders how could somebody make an attempt to flee when he was in a wheelchair. So he had he was treated like a terrorist for these 12 years in the Russian prison. He was released, and 6 months later, the European Court, which of course takes many years to take verdicts, so the judgment of the great of the chamber, of the Grand Chamber, had a ruling whereby he was compensated for the ill treatment in prison. So he made a call. he said that I can't take this compensation because once anybody in Chechnya knows that I have received money, we will be persecuted. So he said that it would be better for this money to be transferred to the banking account of the attorney at law. Now, just a few episodes of what we are doing. Indeed, we have many cases. Many persons from the North Caucasus, specifically from the Chechen Republic, whereby these persons had to move to different regions of Russia. These are internally displaced persons. Now, there is no legal definition in the Russian law about the internally displaced persons. However, this is what de facto we're dealing with in the figure of those persons from the North Caucasian republics who have had to leave their republics because of repression, because of persecutions, because of threats, and move to other regions of Russia. There's also the story of many Russians who had to move out from Chechnya and other Northern Caucasian republics and acquire these status of interned persons or displaced persons. They had to be given residence, and this is yet another social problem which every migrant is entitled to seek as resolution. And this is something that Russia is hardly ever coping with. So one of these internal migrants was waiting for a housing to be given. And many of these people have lost even the glimmer of hope for getting a housing unit. And these people include invalids and people from the most socially vulnerable strata. And I will conclude. I'm just about to conclude, and let me just say the last time this important creed, we're all different and we are all citizens. Now I'm talking about those who are apatrides, the persons without citizenship. We have about 500,000 apatrides in Russia today. Who are these people? These are the former citizens of the Soviet Union or their children who were somehow lost in this process of the breakup of the Soviet Union. For instance, they came into Russia from some republics. They didn't get the citizenship of the country of origin, neither did they obtain the Russian citizenship, because the Russian citizenship law was already adopted in 1991, whereas the citizenship laws of the other Soviet republics may only have followed suit. So, as you know, there were many Georgians, for instance, from Abkhazia, who had to flee Abkhazia, who were banished from Abkhazia, who were forced out of Abkhazia and found themselves in the territory of the Russian Federation. They became apatrids. They did not have Georgian citizenship, neither were they granted Russian citizenship. So we are literally talking about 500,000 people who unfortunately fall out from this formula of all of us being citizens. So these are the people, just like the foreigners. They have to go through routine document checkups, and a court. There is one champion judge, and I'm saying this with a bitter irony, who usually takes a decision on deportation of a person within a minute and a half. It takes him, this judge, about a minute and a half to take a decision on deporting a particular person from Russia. And there's even a practice of deporting whole groups of people. Say a group of Uzbeks brought before a Russian judge who may take less than 5 minutes to rule on their deportation. And they may be cases when these people spend up to 2 years in detainment, even before they're deported. And this is monstrous. So this person may then be released from this detainment center. We have had a case where an immigrant was detained almost 4 times. 4 times. But to end with an optimistic note, some of the Russian barristers have gone to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court of Russia adopted a ruling. And interestingly, that it took the Constitutional Court to make this ruling. So the ruling says that when taking a decision on deportation, the judge must ordain a time in span for the deportation center. And secondly, that the judge must ordain, must make a ruling an implementable decision on deportation. So, in other words, one cannot be deported if there is no country towards which to deport. So, according to this new ruling of the Constitutional Court, a person who has been detained may now go to the court and ask, make an official inquiry. How much longer does this person have to wait until the deportation issue is resolved? If the immigration authority cannot make an opinion as to how long he or she must wait for such a ruling, then such a person must be released from the immigration center. This ruling of the Constitutional Court is unfortunately not followed uniformly in all regions of Russia. In Moscow, it is observed poorly. In St. Petersburg, it is not followed at all. And in some regions of Russia, it is followed quite well, interestingly. So, according to this ruling, in the past several years, many dozens of persons have been released from the detainment centers, and I can only welcome this event. Thank you for your attention. All right, and there's time for questions. I come from the Ukraine. If I may just. In 1932, 1933, many people perished in the Ukraine.
Никто почти в мире об этом.
And not many people know about this in the world. And of course, the reason why do I speak about food, about element? I would like to ask you, there are places in the world which are eponymy of misery. There are places like Yemen. There are places where people just wish to survive. And as it was said earlier today, there are countries where people live in abject misery. A country like Gambia may well simply disappear because its in the lowlands. So when you say 1.5 degrees increase in climate to the Ukrainians, there is not, or even people in Russia, people are not so much challenged, threatened, or they do not fear. Can you give some images, so to speak? How would the climate change affect the people of the world? I think that this story must be very vivid. I'm not talking about right now, but I'm just saying that there has to be a lot of more persuasion in any climate talk. All right, we shall collect several questions and then try to take them as a series.
Hi, Ivana Dragicevic, Croatian School. When I saw the subject climate migration refugees, I was referring just to this, what the colleague from Ukraine just said. Because if you see demography, if you see reflections of climate change, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, as the very important factors of migration and not being just zones of conflict as, for example, Yemen and Syria, and the complexities of it. As an example of Syria, we have complete social fabric of a Mediterranean basin country completely destroyed in 8 of the years of the conflict. So I just want to hear maybe from Ms. Bang a little bit of more what you do in your center, connecting these things and pushing it out to policymakers, because you said, just to quote you right, that you have a lot of, I think, political complexities and obstacles in your work to put it, what he said, as the main cause of concern of today, because one is completely related to the other. Because when you travel throughout Africa, what you see is, you know, from droughts to lack of food. You see it now in Afghanistan. We have the worst drought in 50 years that drawn from the houses more people than in whole of the war together. And if I can just answer you, 2010, you had big fires in Russia. I was in Golitsna. After that, you had Putin wanted to keep the food prices for you know, wheat prices to make the market stable in Russia. But then you had, as Russia exports most of its wheat to north of Africa, the 200% rise of food prices in Tunisia, and you had another fire in Tunisia. The food vendor burned himself out, and you had the start of Arab Spring. So these are the consequences.
Impressive.
Вообще большая честь задавать вам вопрос.
Thank you for my question is to Mrs. Svetlana Gannushkina. I have my great, I hold you in great esteem. I know a lot about your activities and about, do you remember the so-called asymmetric response of President Medvedev, where the migrants were returned to Tajikistan for political reasons? And unfortunately, migrants are often becoming a card in a geopolitical game. Do we often have rulings on the migrant cases by the European Court in Strasbourg, in your opinion? Is there any regularity? I'm Vila Galemin from Moscow. My question is about Moscow, but not quite about. There is a lot of xenophobia. It's probably true in Russia, but in Moscow, xenophobia towards migrants is probably less acute than several years ago. But there is a xenophobia towards the homeless. And in my constituency, it was very important to follow how people react to the homeless. In some residential quarter, people didn't want to have a laundry service for the homeless, and they even started to protest, and people were started to be. There was a counter campaign, so there was a lot of rudeness and harsh talk, and eventually the society didn't change, but we can even see how the attitudes degenerate. It really, the question is about civic education. What can be done for xenophobia to subside rather than increase? And clearly, in Russia, it's hardly possible to work through the government. So what are the civic organizations which help?
Hi, Tamara Puchovsky from Croatia. I have a question for Ms. Syrri. Do you know that recently European Commission published in one of its programs, so it's AMIF program for asylum and migration, and for the first time, as I know, there is a fund for a priority of stimulating legal migration. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that the European Commission has changed a kind of perspective towards migrants and the possible solutions by looking towards the possibility of stimulating migration and actually not just doing that politically, but also putting finances into it. So I was wondering if you know about this, and do you think there is hope of changing the approach to the issue in that way? Thank you.
Thank you. Я думаю, что мы, наверное, сейчас уже ответим, а то мы просто
Take these questions, and if we may just take them. Yes, thank you, Guri.
Okay, thank you for those questions. So I think what I would underline is that this new report that I was referring to from the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change really shows some of the dire consequences that will come from what you say, just 1.5 degree Celsius increase in the global median temperature. So, of course, some regions will be harder hit than others. And in general, we could say that it is the poor countries, the developing countries, that are least capable of handling the changes that are coming. So when the IPCC points to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global mean temperature, they underline that it is the most vulnerable regions, most vulnerable people really on the planet that will be hardest hit by these consequences. And it goes to things like more floods in some regions, more precipitation, more drought in other regions, which could lead to, for instance, more wildfires. Even though this is not the poor part of the world, we saw recently the consequences of wildfires in California, where almost 100 people were killed in the fires, and it was 1,000 people were missing when the fires were raging. So we can expect more of these consequences in different regions around the world. So and definitely also less or more difficulties in producing food, which is of course a really serious problem. And one of the regions that will be hardest hit is the Arctic. The sea ice in the Arctic Ocean will melt totally on a decadal scale if we reach 2 degree warming, but only once in a century if we reach 1.5 degree warming. So it is really a big difference between 1.5 degree Celsius warming and 2 degree warming. And the report from the IPCC from October pointed to this huge difference. And this was the novelty of the report, where they can say that when we reach 2 degree warming, we will see very hard and difficult consequences for humanity. But already at 1.5 degrees, we will see many dangerous consequences of warming. So, yeah. And also, of course, if there is less food production, more droughts, less water access, people will start migrating from those places which is hardest hit. And the report also points to the fact that we will not see thousands of people knocking on Europe's door. We will see millions of people knocking on Europe's door. So it will sort of intensify the migration problems that we have seen over the past few years in Europe.
But it doesn't happen yet.
No.
Or does it?
We haven't seen any sort of direct proofs that warming is the direct cause of migration. But many people have pointed to the fact that in Syria there was water shortage that led to less secure harvests in the countryside of Syria, which led to people migrating into the urban areas, which sort of intensified the conflicts there. But it is difficult to point to the direct connection, like the causal effect of global warming on migration.
I don't suppose all those present in the room know about this. There was a Russian pilot who was supposed to go to court in Tajikistan. He was charged with transporting weapons. We wanted to get him back, probably with weapons too. That's a joke. And since Tajikistan refused to extradite him, then we decided, when I say we, again, so much for your question, excellent question about we, us. Why am I saying we? Because I'm a citizen of Russia, because I feel responsible for this. In other situations, I would say they. But this is where I feel responsible for this country. Our government decided they would exile all the Tajiks because they were spreading infection. And all this dried fruit and rice they would bring from Tajikistan, they discovered Koch microbes and all sorts of bugs. Once they gave us back the pilot, all those bugs died away, perished. And it seems like it's not the first time. Rospotrebnadzor is a Russian health authority is used for political agenda, and all the migration problems are also used for political purposes. And this comes for one simple reason. It is very easy to go against weak and vulnerable category migrants, all the troubles, and canalize the discontent of your own citizens with their way of life, living standards, and their government, and this happens every day. But Dmitry Anatolyevich Medvedev, he was sort of the person who was openly frank, open, so it was a bit, looked a bit ridiculous, but regrettably in more subtle mechanisms. This is used by almost everyone, because in order to not do it, you've got to have political will. We must have to deliberately stop these manipulations, and this is difficult for the government because they are not doing what people want, and they want to distract attention from. Well, the question was, can you get justice under such circumstances? That is the question. Well, criminal persecution was started against the Tajiks exactly on the same day we had for us the so-called Tajik case, where 12 Tajik migrants were blamed for setting up an organized crime group, armed group. In the barracks where they lived in these ugly conditions, they brought in some kind of explosive device, and they spilled so much explosive that it just as if there had been rain made of explosive, and then they put it there. But we looked at this matter in 2012, and all those who were our clients were, it never reached even the court. But regrettably, there was one guy, one of them thought he would pay somebody, and his two nephews got prison terms, one for 2 years, the other for a couple of years. Well, some would give a bribe of $7,000, and we got not just it was never acquittal, but it never goes to court. This is it. They would close down this at the preliminary investigation stage, and under these circumstances, in a very different case, the parents would say, no, we will no longer use your lawyer because we want a guarantee, and they paid $7,000 to the judge, and instead they got 7 years of imprisonment for their children. So they sort of paid for imprisonment. So this problem is also there. Yes, we try certainly to fight this, but when we speak about exiling, it's very difficult because they go to administrative code. It's almost impossible to go against it and to appeal against it. We've been doing it, but it's quite a challenging thing. What I want to add on is that in recent years they've done 2 amnesties for citizens of Moldavia and for those for Tajikistan. For those who lived illegally, they gave them an opportunity to report, to acknowledge that, and to get a registration for the next time. I suppose it was not done on some humane considerations, but they wanted these people to continue to work in Russia, but that was good. So we had positive examples about this too, with Tajiks. Well, so much for the laundry for the homeless and the discussion that immediately develops when the two sides get so heated during the discussion that they start offending and insulting each other. Some cry fascists and say you dislike your own, you'll only like this homeless, so many sick kids, and they keep telling us, what is it, don't we have our elderly, why do you have to take care of? Why do you care for these Africans? Who are they to you? What should I tell you? On the one hand, this discussion in social media, which looks indecent, should not take place so much on the one hand, but on the other hand, one has to talk to people, and as far as I understand, they could say whatever they want. Well, they are such, they've come to Africans, but we show them one child and tell their history, and people bring money, they bring clothes. They're prepared to help. People respond to somebody else crying for help. One individual, not a group, not a mass, but trying to build this enlightenment. These are very high-flown words, but trying to build this communication with society, be it call it civil society, call it just the public, through some concrete examples. We just showed you one old lady, 92-year-old, coming from Baku. We put her picture, showed her story. It was incredibly beautiful, well-brought person. Everybody wanted to help her. Where did you show it? We put it on our website. We invited her to attend the court. Journalists would come in, even NTV. Well, this time we don't allow them in, but this time, about Zhanna Petrovna Ivanyan, we allowed them to tell the story. They made a wonderful story. Yes, and they provoked compassion. And through her, others, people are prepared to take up the problems of the group through the fate of each individual person. But on the one hand, we should acknowledge that we are losing the support of the public because we are known as, so to say, clients, our customers. People who we help, we often take them just as clients, not as equals, not as just. Behind these everyday things that we take care of, we seem to be losing connection with the society, and one has to think about this in trying to find ways to reach out to people so that they should hear, so that indeed should feel it in their heart. And this is something that a person has felt and especially those who blame you for being fascist or whatever, this is something they would remember.
Well, listening to the discussion about climate change, it brought to my mind something that you might have read in the international media over the summer, the wildfire, the huge wildfire where about 100 people died very close to Athens in Mati, which was, of course, a climate change phenomenon because the wind was extremely strong and very, very quick. It was also a result of anarchic building and no proper regulation of urban building. But what the media never reported is that, yes, 100 bodies, dead bodies have been verified. Identified is the word. But there are about 10 bodies that nobody asked for them, so about 1/10. And these are obviously migrants who don't have a family to look for them, who are not properly registered, and nobody cares for them. So this is a response to what climate change brings as well, and how much we can actually, how much, not we, but the states can actually have control of their own populations and what happens. Now, talking about climate change and environmental refugees, the obvious case is Bangladesh, which is a very populous country that will soon go underwater. And yes, it is true that up to now there has been no evidence and data verifying strongly enough the case for the consequences of climate change on refugee flows. Yet this discussion has been ongoing for at least 10 years. And everybody that works on migration and forced displacement knows that at some point the Geneva Convention and the New York of 51 post-war consensus and the New York Protocol of 67 will have to change. Will have to change for many, many reasons. And to this, I'm not really replying to a question, but I had to make this point. Because the Geneva Convention is a product of the negotiation, the negotiated settlement of after Second World War. Many things have actually changed. The Geneva Convention reflects a world that is divided by the Iron Curtain. So refugees, asylum is granted and refugee status is granted to those fleeing as persons, as individuals, persecution based on their political convictions, their race, their social status, their gender, their sex orientation, their religious beliefs. So the 5 categories. But it was really meant for dissidents from the Soviet Union. And this is something that is very rarely discussed. This has changed, and it is now many, many years that it has changed. The first time this was actually challenged was when people from Vietnam started fleeing, of course, communist Vietnam, in the 80s, in their thousands, with small boats. These were fishermen, these were poor people. So from the 80s, this is an ongoing challenge, a sort of hidden discussion that doesn't still take place. My personal view is that with the environmental refugees, when it actually happens, this whole legal arrangement, which is a construct, it has been historically decided in the post-war period, will eventually change. And we are in this period of the change, and that is why there is so much hesitance and so much difficulty in all the discussions that have to do particularly with forced displacement, because nobody can actually define. Professor before Lamer actually spoke about how conventions are made. It's very difficult for states today to decide who has the right to flee and who doesn't. And that's the main crux today. So moving on, Of course, the European Union is also facing the same dilemma and the same difficulty. And of course, President Juncker, even quite a few years ago, about 4 years ago, strives to find legal ways for migration. Whether the very small, very small if you compare it to other EU funding channels, trans-European army funds that go to civil society, how can they ameliorate and improve the situation is debatable. Most of the EU funds go actually to the European Border Police, Frontex. Amazingly higher percentage of the funds goes to Frontex than to the Fundamental Rights Agency, both EU agencies. Yet, you are right, the recent AMIF call has for the first time a very small call for linking origin countries and destination countries and trying to stimulate a discussion between them, trying to find avenues and ways for legal migration. In my view, too little, too late, but still it is an important start. It also reflects the difficulty of the European Union institutions to link or to cross-fertilize migration and development. Third countries, Asia and Africa, are usually viewed through the development lens and not the migration one. So it reflects many, many different syncopated difficulties that the European Union has. When I mentioned in my presentation, my statement before, the creation in Greece in March 2016 of an archipelago of 50 refugee camps, I wasn't fully explicit on that. It is the first time that the decision is taken on EU territory to create refugee camps. This up to now, and it has been done under the auspices and the funding of the ECHO, the European Commission Humanitarian and Aid Development, Humanitarian Development Aid Office, not DG Home. So on EU territory, we had an experiment of importing the model from third countries in Africa and Asia, the creation of refugee camps. Given European history and detention camps, this is very scary. And European politicians should think about it very, very carefully. But of course, there is positive things that are happening. You mentioned the European Court for Human Rights. Just a month ago, there has been a discussion and a decision reversing the decision from a Greek court on the infamous Manolada strawberry killing fields. About 4 years ago, Greek farmers shot Pakistani, of course, irregular migrants, black market economy, picking up strawberries in the Peloponnese in southern Greece. Of course, they were wounded, and some very gravely and narrowly escaped death. Greek court did not give heavy enough sentences, and the case was taken to the European Court for Human Rights, and of course, the decision was very decent. But where my hope really lies is, and I would agree with Madam Gannushkina, is education. And I will give the example of the Greek state in post-2015 reception crisis. At the moment, we have 13,000 refugee children enrolled in Greek public schools. Education is free and obligatory and compulsory for all. So 13,000 children go to ordinary schools. There are special provisions, but including them in the classes, not separating, not dividing them from the student population. Together with other children of migrant origin, they constitute, this takes up the number to 25,000. This is more than 20% of the student population, 4 to 15. This is huge. It is going to change not only the educational system in Greece, but will bring major social changes. And there is one little example. next to Lesbos, which is this island that I mentioned before, there is Samos, another island with a hotspot. Yet the schools there have 500 Greek children, and this year 650 refugee children. So there might be hotspots, but there is also schools.
Вот, прошу вас, давай. Сейчас. Да.
Я? Да. Сергей Губанов, Россия, Балакова.
Balakova. About migration, there is a myth about Russian nation as a very hospitable, and this myth has been many times it's confirmed by Russian history. But all Russians remember several very peculiar wave of immigration from Donetsk and Lugansk. This was supported by the state, by the propaganda, by money, when the state turned towards these people and they would come en masse to Russia. I had experience of talking to these people. They spent winter in Russia, and although they had the money, the state gave them the money, say, we would much rather go to war with you. And many went back home despite the war. I'd like to hear this story about this strange wave of immigration that somehow, is it so much more speaks about today's Russian nation, or is it about a clumsy state? What's your take on this? Yes, please, you would be the first to take. Yes, good evening. Svetlana Alexeyevna, I'm Grigory Frolov from Free Russia in Kiev. My first question is for you, but for others, it's pretty naive, but I think it's fundamental. During the first discussion today, we mentioned two important things. They are Putin and other dictators like this have been attempting to substitute the old rules for the new rules and saying no rules. And the second word was the transformation of political systems that is now taking place in East Europe. In every new regime that positions itself as anti-liberal or illiberal, whatever you call them, one of the fundamental backgrounds is migrantophobia. And knowing the myth that about the time we live in, we realize that the flow of migrants will be rising anyways in the near future, and it means that this will give thought for all those illiberal regimes to develop and continue on their agenda. There is this extreme viewpoint that in order to survive, today's systems will have to follow this turn for the right, which is now seen in a number of European countries, regrettably. And hence my question is, are there any chances now, and should we continue to believe that old rules apply, or if we want to be maximum effectively help these people, or overall try to keep the balance in place, should we try to do something, or has the system undergone reconstruction and nothing can be done? Well, it would be fair towards the people sitting to the left.
Yes, Barbara Freitag from the Prague Civil Society Center. I have two questions to Mrs. Gannushkina. One is whether the current window of reform in Uzbekistan gives a chance to work on issues like deportation and extradition, because the case of Uzbekistan has been particularly grim. And is there a chance to reach some long-lasting solution in this moment of time that can help people in the future? And my second question is about Russia in general. We heard about the rise of social activity from Denis Volkov this morning. Is the issue of migration benefiting from this at all? Or is the social economic degradation behind the rise of protest and activity actually making it worse for this issue, as the number of, left behinds, as you called them, and disaffected people is rising in Russia?
Thank you. Marta Tomaszkiewicz, Newsweek, Polish edition, Warsaw.
I would like to address to Mrs. Bank. What are your expectations about the United Nations Climate Change Conference that will take place in Katowice in a few days? Would the politicians make any significant decisions about the climate change? Thank you.
Who will be first? You again. It probably makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Well, regarding the upcoming rounds of negotiations in Katowice, which was the direct question to me, I'm going to attend myself, and I'm very excited to see what's going to happen in this round of negotiations. There are some really important issues at stake. For one thing, the rule book of the Paris Agreement is going to be completed at this summit. So this means that many of the nitty-gritty issues that were postponed in Paris, because they were too difficult for the negotiators to agree on in Paris, they were postponed and were supposed to be negotiated in this rule book, which is the sort of the fine rules of how the Paris Agreement is supposed to be implemented. So this is a very important thing that is going to be decided upon in Katowice. Also, I will be excited to see, excited to see how the U.S. delegation is going to handle the situation of having announced that the United States is the one and only country in the world that is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, whereas all other countries, including North Korea and other dictatorships, are going to stay in the agreement, but the US has announced that it is going to withdraw, and it's going to be interesting to see how the US delegation is going to handle the fact that they are part of the agreement for another 3 years, at the same time as the whole world knows that they are rolling back all of their domestic climate policies and are waiting to exit the Paris Agreement. So are there going to be a barrier in the negotiations trying to ruin the rule book negotiations, for instance, or are they going to behave in a balanced and sort of withdrawn way? These are important questions that are going to be addressed in Katowice. And well, there was another question that I felt was but I forgot. So I will have to come back to it when you guys have answered.
There were 4 questions for me. May I begin from the last? Social activity and in which way it is reflected. Well, on migration, it doesn't particularly tell on them, but it surely does tell on the work on the non-NGOs. We have dozens of volunteers. We see excellent, wonderful young people, well-educated, knowing many languages, who maybe francophone, speaks English, all of them speak English, and that these young 20-year-olds, their attitude towards refugees is as if they were their kids. They care for them, they take them home. They all complain to the office of the Commissioner, Supreme Commissioner on Refugees. So there's activity among the youth. We do sense it as a very positive. What is nasty that these active young people usually often leave Russia. And one of our top members of the staff now went to Germany, where she is going as an intern. We would want to have her back, but I'm not sure she would. But even as they leave, now in London in Amnesty, we've got our own member of the staff, one who grew up in Krasnodar region and then at Hus, and she's a great help. In point of fact, it means expanding our connections and getting close relations, which is highly important. So, indeed, social activity, this is good. Now, so much Ukrainian refugees. I wanted to speak about Ukrainian refugees. That was the only wave that Russia accepted, and very openly, very kindly both at the level of society and of the state. They built camps in the Rostov region, and they told that they were very high. That was collective treaty. In 2014, by the end of 2014, it was said that the camps are shut down, all of them. And these wonderful, beautiful camps that invested so much money in, and people are now spread all across Russia. They assumed responsibility by the regions. Moscow region, St. Petersburg were relieved of this duty. So we had to fight hard to make sure that at least when the daughter or Ukrainian girl, 20-year-old girl, she's no longer a child, of course, she came to visit her mother, who married a Muscovite. And she couldn't stay there. They wouldn't register her. Moscow businessman bought, or rather gave away his flat in Moscow. He has a house to his own parents. He had to fight to allow his parents, because they were Ukrainian refugees, to allow them to stay. In Moscow, there was something absolutely horrendous. And they had to talk about this on purpose. Thank goodness, at the council under the president, our voice was heard, and the relatives and members of the family were given the permit to stay. One of my customers was offered to travel to Magadan. You're laughing, but she was born there, and she very much wanted to go back there. Magadan is the place of Gulag, one of the most... But she was very happy. A very beautiful woman. She went to her 11-year-old boy. She was so happy she would go back home. It's so happy. She said, Svetlana Alexeyevna, things, I'm fine. We were the first to help me. And I'm getting married. I have my husband who is a pilot. Well, beautiful. These happy stories happen, happy end stories. Somewhere about 400,000 got Russian citizenship. No commitments on settling them. By the end of 2015, they even shut down those special resorts where they were settled, and we just kicked out. And a vast number, like 350,000, used temporary refuge. Some of them got Russian citizenship, now over 100,000. And now they have a new trend last year, since early this year, not to extend them this temporary permit, which is horrendous.
And this is indeed horrendous. Yet again, I say we, that notorious us, because we are responsible for them. Because if we take that this is a war or a conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, that these are the people who were on our side, so to speak. And if we take the elements of this conflict as say, a civil strife in the Ukraine, if we don't take it as an interstate or Russian-Ukrainian conflict, if we take it as a civil strife, I remember this even from the times of my involvement in the Armenian-Azerbaijani war, whereby people literally find themselves on one of the sides. In, say, Donbass area, we had people who were totally who did not believe that this is a conflict which is in any way has a relation to him. However, his neighbor was killed during a bombardment, and then he went to serve in the militia. So he fought, was taken prisoner, and many of the secessionists, so to speak, behaved like a gangster. So eventually he went to Russia, and so this is how people literally find themselves on one of the sides of a military conflict without having any intent to take any sides. And this is the great tragedy of any civil war, or any war indeed. But let me just express a conviction that none of my clients, so to speak, none of the clients would in any way there are cases when people are being deported, or there is a threat to be deported to to Kiev, even though the people fought on the side of the militia. And the problem of the refugees from Donbass is a whole saga. And what happened in the Russian society? The people were taking in families. There was this patriotic zeal. Then I get a call one day, come and get this family from my house. And I'm telling the man, well, sorry, I didn't in any way solicit this family to settle with you in your house. And so eventually they come and complain of what has happened to them. So it is indeed a matter of conviction. If you can't overcome problems, if you can't overcome some, one should certainly never, one should never expect that our clients are angels or near angels. Unfortunately, tragedy, bitterness, vulnerability, tragedy does not often make people angels, quite conversely. So it is often the neglect which we're seeing as a consequence of many humanitarian crises. And this is what we have to understand and take into account. First of all, every one of us must understand that if he wants to go into human rights activism, one has to understand that there'll be much bitterness that he will have to meet on his or her way. But the new Europe. Now, what can I say about the new Europe and what is the phobias of the migrants? I have an article that I wrote about it more than 10 years ago. The old Europe, it may be, it's just an opinion, an observation rather than a judgment, but many migrants from the former Soviet Union, how could they get to Germany? They usually went through the Eastern Europe, and so Poland was the country of the first entry. And this Dublin Agreement, which may be Dublin Agreement number 3, required readmission into Poland. Poland could not cope with this problem. Poland was a young post-communist state just with a nascent democracy. It did not have much practice to accept refugees. It didn't have much finance. And so Poland was facing this problem of readmission. And I think that on the part of the so-called old Europe, Vieux Europe, it was not quite honest. There are poor countries. There are poor countries who simply could not take this load. And otherwise, they would start protesting. And I think that Poland is in a better shape in this case than Hungary. Hungary is, I think, the most deplorable in terms of attitudes towards the migrants. But let me just say that this is certainly a big cluster of problems which are mostly interrelated. So I do believe that the old Europe, and it's not a very happy term, but I'm just using it, the happy Europe, the old Europe must try to consider these problems in all their complexity. It's about a very honest division of responsibility. Without honest division of responsibility, the European Union would not be able to cope with these social ills. And finally, the very last question that I had about Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, a person was recently released, having spent 12 years for nothing, pretty much. He was, and he's not an extremist. He's not a fundamentalist. He has nothing to do with with any religious fundamentalism. He even ate pork. He was never an extreme. So he spent 12 years in Uzbek prison. So everybody was in. So he was released. He wrote a letter to the Strasbourg that he is now ready to accept compensation. And I think that we can see many calamitous results of some of these cases. There has been a case with Uzbekistan, who has a temporary asylum in Europe, but he still is missing Samarkand and his motherland. So he called his friend. He called up his friend in Samarkand, and his friend said, "You come back. Yes, I've just been released from prison, so there is a vacant bed in prison. You come back from your temporary asylum back to Samarkand, and there's a bed ready for you in jail." I'm often embittered by the fact that the European Court allows Russia to extradite persons to Azerbaijan and allows European states to extradite persons to Russia. Just recently, Russia extradited a person to Azerbaijan. And he's under litigation, and Russia sent him home, and the European Court didn't do anything. So there are some changes in the policies of the European Court, which are somewhat concerning to me. So I think that this is a very important, more information about the ex-Soviet space. There is another case of a Talish person from Azerbaijan, and it is well known that Talishs are under persecution as an ethnic minority in Azerbaijan. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.